I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you for being here, for the folks who are here and for the folks whose note takers are here. But good morning. My name's Michele Darchuck. I am excited to be here with Madera Unified's College and Career Readiness Director, Kristin McKenna. So Kristin is going to be speaking about Madera's graduate profile program and how her team utilized Parsec's qualitative analysis platform, Parsec Real, to support with understanding how Madera can make their graduate profile experience more effective and successful for their students. So we are going to dive into it now. Before we get started, I'm going to take a quick minute to let you know who we are. So my name is Dr. Michele Darchuck. I'm a Learning Integration Specialist for Parsec Education. So for any of you who don't know who Parsec is, we are an ed tech company based in Fresno with the goal of making both quantitative and qualitative data accessible and meaningful for your school systems. And my background is in K-12 education. I've taught kinder through third and special education. I've also coached and trained teachers and supported school systems with teacher development and now data analysis with Parsec Education. So Kristin, I will pass it over to you.
Hi, thank you. I am the Director of College and Career Readiness for Madera Unified. And for our district, kind of the buckets that I oversee in my role are career technical education pathways. And we have early career exploration down to sixth grade, a middle school program, and then high school pathways. I'm also in charge of dual enrollment for our district, as well as the graduate profile. And so I was a classroom career technical education teacher before making the jump into administration in 2015. And so that is a little bit about me. And so we're going to dive in today, although I've got lots of hats that I wear, the hat that we're going to talk a lot about today is our graduate profile. So Michele, if you want to go to that first slide.
Yeah, just before we go over to, I'm just going to explain a little bit about what you used on the Parsec
Sounds
end
good.
to do that analysis. But as I mentioned earlier, welcome Laura, what we're going to be talking about today is one of our products. It's Parsec Real. So Parsec Real is an interview tool that allows school systems to conduct interviews with their education partners at scale. So when Kristin dives into her graduate profile work with Parsec Real, you'll be able to see just the number of students that she actually engaged with, which is pretty great if we're thinking about doing qualitative analysis. Another key feature of Real that, as a former educator, I think is the most impactful is that once your interviews have completed, Real actually leverages AI to analyze all of those responses and then create high-level sentiment analysis as well as themes and trends based on the responses that you receive from the interview questions that you ask. So the whole point of this is so that you school system leaders who do not have a lot of time actually have time to look at the data that's being analyzed to make action-oriented decisions based on the feedback that you're getting from your education partners. So yep, Kristin, we're going to dive right into now your graduate profile work and then also the themes and trends that were uncovered so that you could take those action-oriented next steps. All right, so I'll pass it over to you now.
So I'll just start with kind of a high level overview. Lots of districts have graduate profiles, and everyone takes their own little spin on it. So for Madera Unified, our graduate profile was decided to be a set of 6 skills that we thought students needed for once they left us, whatever their post-secondary plans were. And back in 2017, 2018 is kind of when we started and dove into the work. And in order to do that, we brought in multiple stakeholders. We brought in community partners throughout Madera. We brought in administrators, current students, teachers, and then for me, the most telling group was our recent alumni. And so we brought in these students and these adults and asked, what is it that a student or a young adult needs when they enter a career or college right after high school? And through that, we started to come up with some themes. Prior to that work, what really led or made our district jump in this direction is as the director for over CTE pathways, we sat in industry advisory meetings. And it didn't matter if it was culinary arts or welding or health sciences. When we asked employers, what do you need? It was never like this kind of suture or this kind of weld. It was always around the real life or the soft skills, employability skills. And so we were all in. We met with all these stakeholders, narrowed down our theme, and we came up with 6 elements that make up our graduate profile, which you'll see on this next slide. And so throughout that process, we engaged about 200 different stakeholders for in-person meetings. And we came up with these 6 elements that our students needed when they graduated us: think, adapt, communicate, contribute, produce, and collaborate. And so when we think through these, they tie into lessons already, right? We know the 3 C's in education, all of these different things. What was important to us as a district is that we didn't make just some pretty posters and pretty graphics that lived on a wall. We needed to find a way to measure it. What is it that we're going to do to make sure students do this? So we started the hard work of this, I would say, in the 1920 year. There's a rubric for each of these at different grade spans. So we have a think rubric for K1 or TK1, a 2-3, a 4-6, a 7-8, and a 9-12. Right? So what does think look at each of those different grade progressions? And we have those for all 6 elements. And the first stab at our work, or the first starting point for us, was really to find a way to tie these elements into our guaranteed and viable curriculum that our district had. And in 1920, we started really great. And by March 27th, 2020, every site was going to show their evidence of work around the graduate profile. And then obviously March 2020 happened, and we kind of took a pause for a little bit after the pandemic on this work. And after the 2021 school year, we knew we had to get back to this work. It needed to be the North Star for our district. And so in June of 2021, our school board passed that starting with the class of 2025, so my current seniors, all students had to pass a graduate profile, portfolio, and showcase in order to graduate. And so on the next slide, it kind of shows that. So all students this year on March 24th came together to do their showcases. Portfolios were due back in December, and what our portfolio entailed was reflections on each of the 6 elements. So they needed to pick an artifact from their English or math science class that tied to the graduate profile and explain how they demonstrated that element. And then the showcase piece is where the students get up in front of a panel of community members and teachers and share with the district or with the students what it is that they did to master these. And so on the next slide, it talks a little bit more about the showcase. Oh, I didn't put that slide in there. Oh, there it is.
Sorry about that.
Showcase, you're good. The showcase is, like I said, a formal oral presentation that our students do. There's a panel of educators and community members. Way back when our district had a mock interview where students sat in front of 1 or 2 community members, usually 1. They created a resume for a job that they didn't actually want. And they got asked some, tell me about yourself. Why do you want this job? Kind of a questions. So this is really an elevated level. And during the student showcase, they start with a personal introduction. They tell the panel a little bit about themselves, their interests, their hobbies, what they've done in school. The next thing that they did was they shared 2 different elements that were strengths for them or growth areas for them, and 1 challenge. And like I said before, for each of those reflections, they need to show an artifact from their classwork and their learning. And then they share with that panel their post-high school plans. So what is it that they plan on doing when they leave us next year? And then from there, there's a formal Q&A process with educators and the student where they kind of answer some additional questions. Now, obviously, seniors can't just do this once and be masterful at it. So we have checkpoints. In fact, just this morning, I was at Desmond Middle School and our 8th grade students there were doing an 8th grade practice version of this. All 8th graders did that this week at their home sites or Madera Technical Exploration Center, which is our specialty career technical education site. And then sophomore year again. So yesterday I was at Madera South and they were doing sophomore showcases. And so there's these embedded opportunities for students to practice different versions or smaller versions of this to really get comfortable in understanding the rubrics, tying their rubrics to their classwork, and most importantly, getting comfortable talking in front of a group of strangers. And so that's kind of the overall our graduate profile. So before we dive into the piece of the Parsec Reel, are there any questions about our graduate profile or our process to get there that anyone would like me to address before we kind of move on? Okay. Then we'll go ahead and go in, Michelle, to the next slide where we talk about feedback. So We have used Parsec Real for 2 years in some capacity now to really gather qualitative data from our students. In addition, we've done student listening sessions. One shift that our high schools made this year is we have an advisory period. And our advisory period is 25 minutes a week on Wednesdays. And students or teachers have an advisory period of about 20 students. And a lot of the what I would call procurement of the portfolio happens there in the showcase. Now, the work should be tied to the classes, they're reflecting in their classes, but there's kind of that procurement piece. So I had shared with you March 24th was a non-instructional day for all students in Madera Unified, but it was a teacher work day. And all teachers filtered to our high school campuses based on the feeder patterns, and they got to sit on panels watching seniors do these things. And it was a great day. About 92% of students passed that first day. And then obviously it's not you don't get to walk now. We do have opportunities for them to retake. So we did 2 different Parsec Reels. The first one we did was a student survey, and then we also did a panelist feedback survey. And so today I think we're focusing a little bit more on the student survey. So we had about 978 responses to the Parsec Reel, and it was mainly favorable. And we'll jump into the next slide because I want to look at some comparison data. So like I said, 4,600 different submissions, so different questions, 978 different respondents. Just to kind of give you an idea, our senior class between all of our campuses is probably about 1,100. So the majority of our students responded to this. For us, we looked at this in a couple ways. It was very positive. And as we dove into the individual questions and looked at the themes, we found that students really enjoyed the advisory periods this year. They found that to be helpful. In all honesty, for the last couple of years, like I said, 2021, we decided this would be a graduation requirement for this year's senior class. However, right, not the entire system was built. So we were building things as we were going. We were making changes in the best interest of students, but obviously that caused some confusion in their sophomore and junior years. And so the level of clarity we were able to provide this year was noticed and appreciated by students. And that was one of the major themes that we had noticed. So 2024, we did do a Parsec Reel at Madera South, which is one of our high schools, on their mini showcase days. So traditionally in our system, 8th and 10th are our checkpoints. But because this was the first year we were doing this, we felt like last year our 11th graders needed a mini showcase opportunity as well. And I remember sitting down with Babatunde after the sophomore showcase and reading the student responses. And I'm like, oh God, we've messed this up. Like the comments aren't super positive. You know, they feel like they're not ready. There was a lot of anxiety around their public speaking. They're afraid of judgment and ridicule. And now understand in 10th and 11th grade, they give their showcases in front of classmates. Senior year, there's no students in the room. So there is that shift that just naturally happens. But we compared that to this year. And for me, on even our mini showcase days, I don't mind being in a room. I love hearing our students, but I love being in the hallways. Because in the hallway, you feel the students, and this isn't great, but you feel the students' anxiety before they go in. You feel that they're nervous. They don't know what to expect, but then you see them come out of the room. Yesterday, I was at Madera South campus for a counseling training, and just walking around during break, I heard students talking, and it was, I rocked that. I didn't even need my note cards. Oh, I hyped that up way too much. That wasn't that bad at all. They were actually really nice to me. And so, you know, you get this sense of student accomplishment once they've done it. It's not that they're not nervous. It's not that they're not scared, but when they're done, they feel great. And that came out overwhelmingly in our showcase student survey, was that they enjoyed it. This quote right here, the most valuable part of the showcase was to prove to myself that I can be in front of people without being afraid. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of, I have confidence now. I know I can do that. And that was right. That was part of the why. That was part of the why in our design process is students need to feel comfortable in these situations. But getting kids to understand that why, you know, as sophomores or even juniors or seniors, it felt like one more hoop they needed to jump through. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the questions that we asked this year were, what resources or supports were most helpful, right? We want to know what our students found helpful, because as adults, we design things, but unless we get their input, we don't always necessarily understand what actually worked for them as the end user or the kid that has to pass this to graduate. And one of the themes that we did find is that the advisory was appreciated by students. And you see that in that quote over on the left. My advisory teacher did such a great job preparing us for the graduate profile, as well as my econ and civics teacher, and also my English teacher. With them preparing for the graduate profile was a breeze. And in some of the comments as we looked through these from students, you know, there were teachers being called out by name as positive. I think one of the things that's important to mention is we have 3 comprehensive high schools and 3 alt ed sites that are a little bit different. One's a community day school that's very small, one's our independent study, and one's more of a traditional continuation. So we have teachers at each of those sites that get a period off or an hour a day off. So there's 2 teachers at each high school comprehensive site that have a graduate profile planning period. And we call them our leads. And our leads come together quarterly along with our district academic coaches in order to kind of share what we've tried at our school sites, the lessons that we've developed, and what's working and what's not. And so just last week, I was with my leads and we did a SWOT analysis where we really dove in to the feedback that we had gotten through Parsec Real and started to think about what are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to move forward and continue to leverage this work. But what we heard from students, you know, our teachers and our leads, their perception was there was 8 people in a room that was going to be overwhelming to the kids. The kids were going to say way too many people in a room. Didn't even show up as a theme. That's not to say that no student said there were too many people in the room, but that wasn't a theme. On the panelist side, that is something we heard. There were too many people in the room, but that wasn't something that bothered our students. They actually enjoyed having that. A lot of students did, like I said, highlighted the dedication of their teachers and in order to get them ready for their showcases. That advisory class period was something that was frequently referenced by students as being helpful for them. And then practice sessions. A lot of our school sites in the week leading up to showcases, like the English class or the civics class, would let the students practice that showcase orally. On the morning of, we even had a green room where students could go and do a practice round with some people. And we're rethinking that next year based on feedback of let's put a panel in there. So if kids want feedback from adults prior to going and doing their real thing in their assigned room, we can have that opportunity for them next year. But ultimately, the students wanted still some more practice opportunities, getting comfortable in front of an audience. So one of the big things that we started to talk about with our leads, with our site administrators, with our district academics coaches, as we went through our SWOT analysis was, okay, March 24th went great this year, but it's not perfect. What are the improvements or what are the things that we are feeling like we need to do or change in order to make students feel more supported, in order to make sure that, you know, this continues to go? We had heard, and I had shared in full transparency, prior to this year, we had changed the rules, if you will, right? We had changed what we wanted. And we saw that last year in the Parsec Reel that we did with our students. One teacher's telling me this, and another teacher's telling me this. So last year, we really took that advice critically and made sure that we had our ducks in a row, if you will. We had made our final decisions and we didn't stray from those because open and honest communication with the students was really, really important to us. But the students are still wanting more opportunities to practice. And for some of that, and something that we've talked about as a system going down to kindergarten, is students need more opportunities to speak in their classes with feedback. Because so often Michele and Kristin are a group project and Kristin does not want to talk, but she's going to hold that poster. Michele's going to do all the talking. And even if Kristin's talking like this the whole time and you can't hear anything she says, if the teacher never tells Kristin you're not being loud enough or, you know, speak up, I think I'm doing an okay job. And so that opportunity for feedback has also been highlighted from students because they need some help in building their confidence. A lot of students did say that the guidance from their teachers and staff had conflicting advice. So we did still see some of that. And when we really dove into the responses, it was in prior years. So we've already remedied some of that, but any changes or modifications that we're going to make, which are going to be minor to the showcases for next year will be fully developed before students start in August. So that way we're communicating consistently throughout the year. And then the last one was kind of along that same theme, right? So similar theme of making sure that it's there. Now, one of the challenges we will always have is even as the leads present, they do a staff meeting of this is what we want. Depending on the level of attentiveness of teachers in that meeting or their understanding or their absenteeism rate, there may still be some conflicting, pieces of advice. And so just keeping a watch on that and making sure that there's a hub or a place where students can go in order to really be able to, get the right kind of feedback.
All right, awesome, Kristin. Thank you for sharing that. So as we kind of went through these past slides, you've seen these artifacts showcased on our slide decks that are showing you features of the real tool that Kristin's team leveraged to be able to make those action-oriented next steps based on the actual feedback from her education partners, whether it were the panelists or from the students that actually participated in the graduate profile work. So I don't know how many of you have participated or conducted focus groups, but typically you don't have the capacity to interview 4,600 students, right? We don't have the time to do that or the money to like employ a full staff to be able to do that. So that's where Parsec Reel comes in handy because it's just the click of a link or the scan of a QR code. And then your students or your, in this case, the panelists that were participating or teachers or parents can actually answer the questions in a real format. It's open-ended responses. If they'd like to type in their response, they can. If they have lower access to literacy or they're more comfortable speaking, they can actually speak their responses or record a video of themselves. So it's really meant to be an accessible way for your community members to share their feedback with you in a way that you can take action-oriented next steps. Because for those of you joined a little bit later, Reel does leverage AI to aggregate all of that data for you within an hour and then create those top level themes and trends, not only for the entire interview, but also for each question. So this was the entire interview's AI analysis by sentiment of how the students experienced the profile process. So you can see here 56% of the responses that came in were positive. That's great, right? They are 56% of those 978 students are experiencing the graduate profile program positively, which is great. And then by each answer type, you can see the top level themes and trends that came in. So that was a way for Kristin's team to be able to actually go in, take those action-oriented next steps, not only to compare what the panelists assumed the students were going to experience, but also what the students were actually experiencing themselves. And then to say, okay, next year, this is what our team needs to focus on when we're going in to support our campuses with the graduate profile work. And so that just gives them, actual data to use rather than making guesses or assuming that one experience at one campus is going to work for all of the campuses. So that kind of leads us to Parsec's recommendation for how you ask not only questions or interviews to your community partners, but really the process that you should work through when you're trying to collect really meaningful qualitative analysis, whether you're using Reel or not, right? So the first thing that Parsec Reel does really well is we don't collect personal identifiable information. So if your community partners choose to respond in a written format, it's completely anonymous, right? They can give you real feedback without worrying that something's going to come back to them. Maybe the student is afraid that if they say, hey, in my history class where we were supposed to do this, it never happened. And they're afraid that the teacher's going to get in trouble or something like that. That won't happen because it's completely anonymous, right? Listen for those themes. So focus on those patterns, right? So like Kristin mentioned earlier, some of her students felt a little underprepared, but a lot didn't. So that's a theme, right? That's a theme that we need to make sure that we're taking into account when we're making those next step decisions. And then what Madera does really well is actually turning those insights into action. So the number one indicator of survey fatigue, this is a study that was done by McKinsey, is that your survey respondents feel like nothing is going to happen based off of the feedback that you're giving. So I always give the example of anytime I take a flight on a specific airline, I always get randomly selected to take their survey of how it went, right? And then I'm like, no, thank you. I'm not going to change the airline industry if I take your 26 question survey. That's going to take a ton of my time and you're not going to follow up with me anyway, so it doesn't matter. Um, so we know that if that same type of action happens, especially with students, they're not going to be incentivized to give you that feedback. So making sure that you're actually taking action based off of the feedback that you're getting is critical, not only to improve your systems, but to let your education partners know that you care, that their voice is valued, and that their feedback is actually changing their environment. And then also check back in. So make sure that as you implement an interview or implement a qualitative analysis kind of modality, that you're actually progress checking on the actions that you've taken. So Krista mentioned earlier, they used a smaller sample size in 2024. They only did one school where they gave the real interview to. They got some feedback. They made some changes, and then they did it again with a larger sample size. So this is a way for them to not only implement action-oriented next steps, but to actually see if those next steps made a difference and actually were meaningful for their education partners. So Kristin, thank you for sharing your graduate profile work with us and with our webinar participants, and also using real. That's my favorite part of this job, is getting to see how this work affects you and your work and makes your job easier. But now we have some time for those of you who are on the webinar to ask either myself or Kristin any questions about either Kristin's work with the graduate profile or Parsec's work with qualitative analysis. Okay, I typically count to 30 in my head, and that was 30. Um, please feel free to follow up with us via email. I'm actually going to drop my email into the chat so that you all can have it. It's just michelle@parseceducation.com. So if you have questions for me about any of the qualitative analysis pieces, or if you have a specific question for Kristin about the graduate profile, I can pass it along to her to answer it for you. Awesome. Thanks, Ryoji. Alrighty. Okay, that kind of brings us to the end of our webinar for today, but we also appreciate your feedback at Parsec. So if you don't mind COVID restaurant style scanning this QR code to give us some feedback, that would be great on how these webinars are going for you and anything that we can improve. And then also Brandon just dropped the form into the chat. I'll give you all a couple seconds to do that. And then finally, we do host a summit every February. So February 2026 will be our next summit. This is where we actually get not only education leaders from throughout the country in Fresno, which is really great, but also throughout California, and together to kind of talk through not only Parsec's products, but also ways to make meaningful education change based on the data that you're getting from either quantitative analysis or qualitative analysis. So it's called our Measure What We Value Summit. Right now, tickets are 50% off. So if you would like to go to parsecsummit.com, we would love to see you in person. All right, I will always end it with any final questions that anyone may have, or anything that you would like for us to explain further.
I just say thank you. This was really helpful.
Good. Awesome.
We're not there yet, but in like a year or so, maybe we'll be ready.
That's awesome. I mean, education is like turning a
Cruise ship.
giant ship, right?
Slow and wide. Slow and wide. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we got to make that change slowly but surely. And you always see, I think, the fruits of your labor like 10 years down the line. So there's that too.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right, y'all.
All right. Thank you.
Thank y'all for being here. I hope you have a great rest of your week and a happy end of the school year. Happy Memorial Day weekend.